user group that we've hosted. We hosted the first one about a month and a half ago now, which obviously seems like a very long time, because we obviously initially had intended to have that in person, and about a week before we had to make it a remote based one, as the sort of guidance started coming out about what we should be doing, and eventually obviously we got put into this situation. But the reason we wanted to kind of bring it forward, because we were initially planning on having it once a quarter, is across the entire footballing industry, and actually the sports space as well. There's been so much demand to actually use this time now that football's kind of on hold to work more with data within the game. So actually we're seeing so many clubs coming to us with different ideas of where they'd like to do. It can be the performance analysis side, it's the recruitment side, it's the injury side, it's even the commercial side of it, fan engagement. There's so many variants of actually where clubs now are thinking in different ways, and it seemed pretty obvious to me that we should keep everyone engaged and make the most of this time we've got. Effectively, it's a time, a bit like pre-season, where clubs can focus on other things more than game Saturday, game Tuesday, game Saturday, game Sunday, and just keep turning that over. So I wanted to give this opportunity to everyone. In those conversations, it's actually how me and Hannah start speaking. So reached out to Hannah just to understand a bit more about what she was doing in sport, and she basically gave me a really good overview of her story and thought she'd be a fantastic person to speak. So we've got Hannah speaking today, and I don't want to take too much away from her when she does her introduction. So I'll leave it at that and let that come across. And then we've also got James in his Burnley hat and Chelsea shirt, who obviously will be aware of from the previous user group. If you aren't aware of James, he's our Tableau public ambassador, and he also runs our Sport Viz Sundays. So James is with myself, Eva, have founded the user group, and he's going to be speaking about again how you can use Tableau in that sporting environment, and actually giving us a kind of a run through of the different use cases, etc. So on that, I'll pass over to Hannah to do her introduction, and we're now also going to switch our webcams off, because we're very aware of the bandwidth that's going around here. So everyone, enjoy the session.
Thanks, Oscar. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see the screen as well.
Okay, great. So as Oscar suggested, today I'm going to talk a bit about my journey in football. So I've titled this the Football Analytics Department, What is it, and do we need one? So hopefully throughout this presentation I can give you an overview of what my thoughts are on that, the way that I've delivered football analytics projects in the past, and my take on how I see that role growing in football and sports. So before I get into that, I thought it might be useful to give a bit of background on who I am. So I'm probably not the traditional football club employee, in the sense that I've never been a professional sports person or don't have a background in sports. I more just enjoy playing quite substandard Sunday league football and occasionally surfing. But my background is in economics and statistics. So I studied that at university, and then my first real role in analytics was at a university. And it was at a quite interesting time where the tuition fees had been lifted and universities had to take a different approach to recruiting students. They actually needed to go out and recruit them rather than being overwhelmed by applications. And they realized that they had a wealth of data, and that they had a lot of questions that they could ask, but they didn't have any platforms or tools or technology to bring those together. And I suppose that's the parallel then that I started to see in football as I started to get some work experience on a voluntary basis. And then in 2017, I joined Everton. I originally joined as a data scientist, I think because that was sort of the role people were looking to recruit. But when I joined the club, we realized as a team that data scientist wasn't necessarily what they needed at that time, and we instead focused on establishing what I'm going to call an analytics environment. and we couldn't really come up with a more catchy job title than football information manager, but I suppose it's a good description as any of what I did while I was there. So I was there for 2.5 years, and then decided to leave in July 2019 and establish my own company, which I've called Riptide Analytics, inspired by my sort of hobby of surfing. And then since then, I've delivered some projects for the Belgian national teams and for the Premier League. And I'm then looking to continue to deliver projects across sport in this area. So I thought I'd start by outlining why I think that analytics in sport has sort of grown such that people are now looking toward employing specific data analysts or football analytics managers, data scientists, and starting to consider growing an analytics department within their club. Firstly, the volume of data in football and in sport has grown over the years. There have been sort of increased competition in the data providers for event data, fixture data. There's a wealth of competition now around recruitment data, so there are a lot of platforms emerging that will supply you with different levels of recruitment data. Clubs themselves have started focusing on capturing more data. So right down to the academy level, people are looking to increase the amount of testing and screening they do. They're using the GPS data. Performance analysis has taken off into the data arena and started to not only use video, but also use data. Recruitment's becoming more data focused. And then alongside that, the tools and technology that you can use to process that data has become affordable and accessible. There's been a real growth in bringing data analysis and visualization to everyone, and the idea that you don't necessarily need to be an analyst with an analytical background to make use of data now. And then all that's really fueled by the financial importance of decisions in clubs. So as academy operations scale up, academies get bigger, and as the value of transfers increases, the importance of making the right recruitment decision or developing a player from the academy and getting them through to the first team is becoming increasingly important, and also in itself justifies an investment in analytics. Now, working across national associations or leagues or clubs or even universities, everybody really has the same basic issues of they have access to a wide range of data, and they know they want to be using it. And then they also have really skilled individuals within their organization who know what they want to know. They're experts in their subject, but they don't know how to bring those two things together. And that really is sort of the gap that me or people like me have started to fill in clubs. So before I talk about then how I see myself delivering those projects and my experiences, I wanted to just talk about some of the themes of the presentation and some sort of the philosophy that I work towards. So I think the first thing is that the common misconception is that if you've got a lot of data or you go out and hire 4 data scientists, that makes you industry leading. I often hear people talk about using data innovatively, or we need to use data, or I've got all this data, but I don't know what to do with it. But really, what's going to give you that competitive edge isn't buying data or hiring data scientists. It's about the people in your organization working together and using a diverse set of skills to deliver an analytics strategy. So the data in itself is not going to give you the edge. It's about listening to the strategic leaders, identifying the core questions, and then using the right technology and the right skill sets to deliver that. And in reality, the work that I do with clubs and organizations, the results are only ever as good as the people that I work with in those clubs. So the people coming up with interesting and industry leading questions, the work that I do then is is to facilitate the delivery of that. So really, it's relying on the data isn't enough, and you need to really approach any analytics strategy as a team. So I keep talking about an analytics strategy or an analytics environment, and I think one of the things I wanted to make clear is that you can establish analytics as its own department, and if you've got the resource to invest in a big team of individuals, then that's going to be a really great thing for your organization. But really, football analytics should be seen as a function that supports the departments in the club, and it should facilitate the delivery of your club's vision and philosophy. And each of the departmental leaders across the club should feel like you're there just to help them and support them. And equally, then the football analytics environment should work with the people who are responsible for capturing and processing the data to help them do that in a way that facilitates that top layer of analytics. So your role is to act as a go-between in the club, to be a translator or a source of expertise, and to set up an environment that can facilitate the questions at the top, working right down to identifying what data you need. So, for example, one of the roles when I was working at Everton, we were looking at how we can better capture testing and screening data. And my role in that wasn't to understand the many tests that were being delivered, because the physios and the head of sports science and medicine, they understood that that's their expertise. But my role was to help them make sure that they were capturing the data in the right way, storing it in the right place, and then processing that data such that they could then answer all the questions that they needed to answer. As part of that, I needed to understand the aims and objectives and what we were trying to achieve, but I importantly wasn't the subject expert there. So my role was to facilitate that. So I thought it would be useful to bring that to light by giving you a few examples of the projects that I've delivered to date. The first one I'm going to talk about is my time at Belgium. It was a really interesting project because we were essentially starting from an almost blank canvas. The organisation had a really clear vision. They knew what they wanted to achieve. They had identified the people in the organisation to lead the project with me. And we also had a very strict time frame. So we needed to deliver the project in time for the camps, for the Euros. So it was a really focused project with quite a few restrictions around time and the tools needed to use and exactly what we needed to achieve. And another key was to demonstrate the value to the wider business, because this project was going to be smaller scale, but also prove the value of analytics and then allow them to expand at a later date. So what we were able to do was we were able to extract from their football strategy the key questions that we could answer in a short time frame. So what were the 4 or 5 most important things that they wanted to know in order to support their delivery of the national camps? And we identified the 4 audiences of the coach, the technical director, the head of performance, and the departmental performance analyst. So these were 4 audiences that we wanted to support during the camps. And what we were able to do then is work backwards from there and identify what tools and technology could we use whereby we could set up an automated workflow that takes all the data from source, so from stats from their scouting platform, the physical data, and from their internal profiling of players. How could we process all that into an analytics platform that importantly could be managed by their performance analyst and data analyst that they'd that they wanted to deliver this project when I left and they took over the management of the project. We needed to make sure it was simple and it could also be managed by people who their job actually wasn't that full-time. They had to deliver their performance analysis role alongside this. So coming up with a really complicated coded environment wasn't necessarily the way we could go. So my role in that was to work with them to identify the best technology, to build some example workflows, to build some example reports, help them get going, but also to train the end user and hand over that project. And the real success of this project was the team that they built around this analytics platform. So they had clear leadership from the top. They had buy-in right from the manager down to the coaches, to the analysts. Everyone supported the project and was open to receiving the data and the analytics. They also had a very good IT team that were willing to support the delivery of this longer term. So the team around this was really important, and the openness as well to adopting new technology. So the second example I wanted to talk through was at Everton. This is a good example of using almost the same data, but in a completely different way. So at the academy, when I joined, they already had an analytics setup within sports science. The sports science analyst had been doing a lot of work around the GPS data and processing that and visualizing it. And they actually had a very strong setup in that department and a good understanding of the kind of things they wanted to deliver. But where they found themselves was at capacity, that the sports science analyst was also delivering the GPS program, and this was a small part of his role. And then additionally, as they started to demonstrate value through visualizing the data in Tableau, there was more and more requests coming in, and one individual doing things quite manually couldn't really scale up. So my role was to come in and support the sports science analyst to expand what he'd already started to build. And what was important here is that the setup that they had on a small scale was very good. And if I was to come in and say, okay, now we're going to establish a central analytics department and we're going to take all your data away from you and we're going to take control of it, and then we're going to produce reports and you can tell us what you want us to build, that really actually is a worse situation for that analyst, because all of a sudden all their subject expertise is lost and the control they have over their own data is gone, and all the knowledge they have about that data is gone. And just because the analytics department know how to code or how to build workflows in Alteryx or databases doesn't mean that they're better placed to lead this project. So what was really important here is that the sports science analyst was at the forefront of this project and really drove the expansion. And what we were able to do was to take the GPS database and then additionally incorporate coaching databases, injury databases, growth and maturation databases, a central player database, and pull all that data into an automated environment such that the sports science analysts no longer needed to spend all their time processing data. They actually spent a lot of time instead building visualizations. So we did a lot of work on upscaling on Tableau and how to make the most out of Tableau on online sharing platforms. And then that analyst was able to produce a number of reports across lots of different departments. And that then took it from good practice in one department to good practice across the whole academy. And that then allowed the academy to focus on answering questions across coaching, performance analysis, first team sports science, we're able to utilize the same GPS database across the academy, the 23s and the first team. And that really was all about efficiency of processes. We didn't go out and buy any additional data. We didn't really have to capture any additional data that wasn't already there. It was about organizing that data and putting it into a central platform, which meant that the good work that was delivered in sports science was then able to be utilized by all other departments, including the first team. I think what was really key in this project was the buy-in of the club. So they saw football analytics as something that could support the whole academy, not a department that was going to be given some research questions and then could go off and work in isolation and decide what that department, the football analytics department, thought was interesting about GPS data. It was about using the expertise that existed in that sports science environment. The third project I wanted to talk about was the performance analysis project at Everton, and this is a good example of the benefit of investing in having a structured football analytics environment. This was about 12 months into my time at Everton, and myself and another analyst who was now working at the club had spent a lot of time building a central environment that was automated and included data from sports science, coaching, feeds such as Opta. It included our central player database, some recruitment information. Really, it was a sort of a data store in a sense. It was sitting there ready for whenever a new question came along. And when the performance analysis manager joined Everton, they came with what this image is on the right is a PowerPoint of ideas. They came in with a strategy, a performance analysis strategy, and said, these are my aims and objectives. This is what I want to achieve. And here's an idea I've got for a report that I think could help us to answer some of these questions. Then what we were able to do as an analytics department was to work with that individual to say, okay, this is really good. These are really interesting metrics. We understand how they support the strategy. What we propose is you move this into Tableau. We can automate the processing of data into that report. And additionally, then later down the line, if you want to incorporate some additional data sets, such as physical data sets or some bits from recruitment, we can incorporate that also. That's what we did, and we were able to build the beginnings of 2 key reports within a matter of months. So rather than having to go right to the beginning and say, okay, we need to go to find out how to process the Opta data, and that's going to take us 8 to 10 months. And then once we finish doing that, we're then going to design a report. We were able to just hit the ground running, and we were able to produce these reports within months. And then when I left the role, these reports were handed over to the new football information manager, who's then been able to take us even further and incorporate physical data into this report and make it a real cross-departmental report. So the important part about this is the pace we were able to move at. This data already existed, it was already being used for other purposes, and all we needed was someone to come with a question and their own expertise, and then we were able to deliver reports that answered those questions without having to really build anything new. And then the second important point about this is that it's sustainable. So I'm not there anymore. There's a new football information manager, and they're leading and building on this. So it's not reliant on one individual. And one of the things that clubs are often vulnerable to is they get a really, really good analyst who comes in and builds lots of exciting processes and does lots of exciting research, but then when they leave, it's gone and you're kind of back to square one. But really, that doesn't need to happen. The tools and technologies exist now such that you can build a quite simple platform internally that protects you then. The last thing I wanted to talk about is how does this actually look in terms of delivery? I think one of the questions I get a lot is, okay, I understand what you're trying to achieve, but how does that work? Like, how do you do that? So the way that projects like this tend to work is you've got the project design on the left-hand side. The club has a strategic lead. They have their own vision. They know what they want to achieve. They really drive the project. And then typically I will work with them to identify then the tools and technologies they should use. I might help them by building some data sets and some reports to sort of get them going with the project. And I'll then help them with the training and upskilling of the staff that exist in the club. And then following that, I'll then hand over the project to whoever the club have identified as taking ownership for either the environment or department, depending on how you decided to set up. What's important about this method of delivery is that it's not about coming in with my approach to analytics and imposing that on a club or an organisation. It's about understanding the vision and way of working of that club. What do they want to achieve? And then helping them to develop that internally, so they then own and manage that system or environment, rather than being dependent on an external organisation. And that way you can customize it to your own resource limitations or budget, or what you think is important, what your strategic priorities are. Is it recruitment? Is it physical development? Is it the academy? And it's about a tailored approach, really. So to finish, I just wanted to outline what I think are the key themes, really, that everyone should have in mind when starting a project like this. So really, most of the data you need already exists in your club. It's either sitting there being analysed by individuals in silos, or it's sitting there not being analysed at all. But the chances are the majority of what you have already exists. It's really important to make use of the skill sets that you already have. So within the club, you'll have sports scientists, you will have people working in recruitment, operations, education, medical, performance analysis, coaching. All these individuals can use data. They can analyze information, and there will be individuals there who will be willing and excited to develop some skills around visualization and analysis. So importantly, in order to get going with this, you don't need to go out and hire 4 or 5 data analysts necessarily. And equally, if you spend time investing in the staff you've got and upskilling them, you can make use of their subject expertise at the same time. It's really important to demonstrate the value as you go along. Typically outside of football, but I'm starting to hear some versions of it within football as well. People spend 2 years investing in building a huge database, and they spend hundreds of thousands of pounds investing in it, and people are just sitting around waiting to see the value of this analytics project. And people saying, in 2 years' time, you're going to be able to do predictive analytics, you're going to be able to do machine learning, which are all great goals and ambitions. But actually, let's demonstrate some value now. Let's get buy-in from people, get people excited. And it doesn't need to be a complicated report that you deliver. It's just getting that information in front of people. And then the final point is to build with flexibility in mind. So I think one of the first things I touched on is that over the past few years, we've seen the technology and the data providers change rapidly, and that's only going to increase. So the number of data providers will probably continue to grow, the types of data that you can use, the increases and advances in technology. So if you build your analytics system around becoming really, really good at processing one type of data, right now you then might be the leaders, but as soon as technology changes, you want to be able to change and you want to be able to make use of it. So overly investing in one software or tool or piece of data can sometimes be a bit detrimental in the long term. So using tools that allow you to be flexible is really beneficial. And that's everything from me. So James, if you want to take the reins as presenter.
Sounds good. But before I do that, we have had quite a few questions come in while you're talking. So if that's right, we'll go through some of these and then yeah, we'll pitch these questions to you now. So the first one, this one's from Stuart. He has asked, are there any free football data resources that go beyond the standard metrics, for example, goals scored, games played? He's interested in passing direction stats, which are up to date, i.e. not limited to 2018 or earlier.
So the free passing stats that I've used are the stats bomb, the release of stats bomb data that can be quite a useful one to use when you're trying to explore that kind of information. It's quite limited in the volume, but it will give you a good idea of how to structure that data and the kind of tools you can use. But I suppose in terms of free resources on that, there aren't that many around that I know of or have used.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I think StatsBomb have got at the moment all of Messi's playing data within La Liga. It's got some women's football data, and I think they're talking about releasing some data from the Arsenal Invincible season. So it's not none of that necessarily meets the parameter of being up to date and recent, but it's certainly a good resource for playing around and actually having a look and trying to work with some of this data that the clubs are actually using as well. Next question from Adam.
Oh, sorry, can I make a quick suggestion? Because I know that we have some people dialed in from Stats Perform, and I'm not sure what resources they have, but if there is something that that they want to help people become aware of, maybe they can message us and we can share it at the end of this webinar, or as an email afterwards if they have any free resources that is really more around position data.
Sounds good. Good idea. Next question for Hannah. From your experience, which club department or areas do you think data is most useful, and which departments have typically been the most engaged?
So I think where it can be useful in every area. I suppose it depends what your objective is as a club. So if you are looking at it from a financial point of view, then focusing on recruiting the right players or developing players from your academy into the first team, if you're thinking of it from a return on investment point of view, those two areas are going to be really important. So those would be, I suppose, your most valuable in terms of a financial point of view, but then equally focusing on the performance of players who are in your current squad is also hugely valuable from a finance point of view. Every single department across your academy and first team has data. I don't think I've come across one department where data hasn't been useful. In recruitment, there's huge volumes of data in terms of you've got your reports from your scouts, you've got video which can be converted into data. You've also then got your event data coming from your event data providers, your tracking data, all of those which can be used to profile players. Performance analysis, you've got huge volumes of data to analyze what your current players are doing. Sports science, you've got huge volumes of data in terms of the physical performance in training, physical performance during games, the physical development of players, data that can support your rehab, information to support your understanding of injuries. I think it's it's difficult to say any department is more important than the other, really, in terms of data. It really depends on the focus and philosophy of the club. So what are your priorities as a club? Is the development of youth players one of your priorities? If so, then data can definitely support you there. As a club, are you trying to focus on the transfers of players out of your academy? Are you trying to focus on your loan strategy? It really depends, I think, on the priorities of you as a club.
Sounds good. There's a few questions that I'm going to try and group into a single one here. Lots of people asking about tools and which different tools that you use to work with data. Given that this is a Tableau user group, is there anything that you can say on the tools that you work with alongside Tableau? So I know there's examples such as Rob Sudby at Norwich using a lot of Alteryx together with Tableau, so preparing the data and then analysing it and visualising it in Tableau. But yeah, in your experience working across these different clubs and organisations, how have people supplemented using Tableau with either Python or Alteryx and so
on? So I suppose when you're thinking about using Tableau as your visualization tool, you then want to make sure the data that sits underneath Tableau is structured in the most effective way. And the tools that you want to use as an organization will largely depend on the current IT setup of your organization. So if you're a small team on the football side and you've got an IT team that already exists in the business side of the football, it makes sense to use tools that they might also be comfortable with because they can then offer you support. So for example, if your organization uses Office 365, there's a lot of you can take advantage of a lot of the tools that come with that. Alteryx is a great tool to use with Tableau. I think there's a lot online about how those two tools work together. And if you're looking to work on a smaller scale, it can be really useful. If you don't want to also employ lots of coding experience, it's a really good tool to use. But then equally, there are affordable databasing systems out there that you can use to work with Tableau. I think it's really difficult to recommend any individual tools without understanding the environment that someone's in, or the budget restrictions, or the skill sets. Usually that's a big part of the project, is identifying the best tools to interact with Tableau and how you can then build an environment using those tools that is sustainable and manageable based on the resource that you've got. But one thing I would say is that there are a lot of tools now evolving that kind of take away the need to have such a heavy focus on coding and can make it more accessible. And that's probably a trend that we will continue to see in this area. I suppose if you're looking to develop a skill set at the moment to help with that, so you're thinking, should I be learning R or Python or SQL? I suppose my approach was learn them all.
Sounds good. And I'm sure people have got plenty of time over the weekends, and now looks like in the UK that the rain has set in instead of being able to go outside at the moment, so perfect opportunity for that. And I've seen that Caroline as well, there's a question around increasing their skill sets, working with data. I'm sure many of you will have seen this already, but Tableau are offering their e-learning free for 90 days, and that basically involves getting started with different pathways. It provides lots of online content that you can have a look through, and if you follow anyone on LinkedIn that uses Tableau, you'll probably see that they've been adding badges to their LinkedIn profile. So once you've completed a test, you'll be able to take a skills assessment and then add a badge to your LinkedIn, which is delightful.
Yeah, and those resources are really useful. It really does help to get practical examples when you're trying to use Tableau. So I'd recommend them, and we use them a lot in different clubs to help upskill different staff around the club as well.
Yeah, I wanted to just add to that as well. Where we've had, like I mentioned, demand from clubs, I started to correlate a list of different football-related Tableau trainings that we've got. So if anyone is interested in those specific trainings, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to just share them with you. They're all linked to football as well. That's all from me.
Perfect. So last couple of questions for you, Hannah. I think as a panelist, you can see these questions coming in. So if there's any that I have missed, then you can pick them up while I'm doing my talk, if you'd like. But a couple of interesting ones here. This one's from Jamie Kite. Where do you see data analytics progressing within football? Are we looking at more specific roles being created? For example, lots of talk around an 8-man team being created at Man United.
Okay, so firstly, I hope United don't just focus on focusing men, they also focus on employing women. Big advocate for that, but I the premise of the question. I think it depends on the resource that you've got as an organisation and the scale of your operation. If you're looking to focus on, if you've only got really budget to employ one individual or to invest a small amount in building an infrastructure, and you need to make use of the team that you've got in place, it's going to be a focus on how you can best use the technology and how you can upskill those around you. Whereas if you're thinking of this on a larger scale and you've got the resource to invest in sort of 8 new positions, then you might look to coordinate an analytics department rather than focusing just on the technology. Obviously, the more time and resource that you can invest into this, it's going to expand how fast you can move, how many questions you can ask, how much you can produce at any one time. So if you as a club have the resource to do that, then I can't really see a reason that you wouldn't do that. But equally, it's not a necessity. You might want to start small and demonstrate the value. You might just not have the budget to invest in 8 individuals. Additionally, I think in larger clubs there's more of an immediate focus on, okay, we want to do data analysis and we want to implement a strategy, but we also want to focus on AI and machine learning and processing large volumes of tracking data. And if you've got the resource to do that, then that's probably the way that you're going to set up.
Fantastic. And then final question here from Sam. Both environments that you spoke about in your presentation, it sounds as though buy-in from key stakeholders is really important. Have you experienced cases where some key stakeholders were resistant to adopting analytics, and how did you approach trying to gain their support?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose in the presentation I highlighted the buy-in from individuals, but alongside that there were also a lot of individuals that didn't understand the purpose or felt that data doesn't have a place in football, or think, yeah, it's probably useful in recruitment, but actually, I don't understand how it's going to apply to the coaching environment. I'm more interested in what I'm going to deliver on the pitch. I haven't got time to be looking at graphs. But that's where it's really important to demonstrate the value. So try and identify some key projects that people are going to be interested in and get them out there quickly, so that you're not constantly talking to people about the theory of what you can produce, or if you work with me, then in 9 months' time I can give you this. It's okay, so we had a conversation 3 weeks ago, and look, this is what I've produced for you. So I think one of my most simple examples was working with one club. One of their problems was, I want to be able to say happy birthday to the players. I think it helps build relationships, but I don't know when their birthdays are. We use Tableau to automate sending out a birthday list, and it sounds, how is that even relevant to analytics? But it was a gateway, and it got people enthusiastic, and it got them to understand, okay, so if I put this data here, then I only have to update that once a year, and then it's going to give me this valuable piece of information throughout the rest of the year. And actually, been able to relate to players who are 8 and say happy birthday when you potentially want them to sign when they're 9 is actually a valuable recruitment strategy. So it's a good example of picking projects just to get people engaged. And equally accepting that some people are always going to be a bit resistant, but you kind of just have to keep going.
Excellent. So I think that there are a couple more questions, but if Hannah, you are able to take a look through those in the Q&A section, then that would be great. I think we covered most of them, and thank you for your answers, and thank you also for your presentation. It was really good. And I think now we shall move on. I will share my screen, and got about 35 minutes talking through data visualization in sport and football. So I think off the back of that, something that I picked up on that last question actually is how some people are resistant to using this kind of stuff, and I think data visualization plays a large part in making football and using data a lot more accessible to people that are perhaps a little bit more resistant. So the idea of what this presentation is going to be about, we're going to talk first about standard charts, things that you would find in any business. So at Biztory, where I'm working, we work with a range of different industries, different clients, and I want to talk about a few charts that you'll see across any industry, and a few tips about how you can then make those charts a little bit more accessible and to tell a bit more of a story. And just the simple ones that Tableau often defaults to. So there is a little bit of work that goes into making charts more readable, making it easier for the audience that ultimately is going to be consuming visualizations. And then the second half here, I'm going to focus on 2 specific charts that you would only tend to see in football. One specifically, the other one you might see in other places, but through a range of different factors, it seems to have become synonymous with how data is presented when you're thinking about player stats and how to compare 2 different players in terms of their qualities and what a manager or what a scout might be looking for. So the key here is thinking about principles, not only within football, but in data visualization. So in football, you've got a set of principles that make up attack, defense, thinking about whether you want a high line and playing an offside trap, or thinking about different principles and ideas to make the most of the time that you've got on the pitch and to ultimately go ahead and get a victory and beat the opposition. And the same ideas apply to data visualization. So within data visualization, we're thinking about encoding information with different properties. So I've put up a few ideas that are quite common, thinking about things like length. So the bar chart uses length. You're encoding the data with a visual property so that it is easier for the audience to then understand and interpret something from that information. Color is a very popular one as well, and sometimes these different ways of encoding data can be used together in quite a powerful way, so that someone who is looking at your dashboard or someone who is looking at a chart that you've created can very quickly get to an outcome that you have spent time to actually create and explain to them. Representation is all about the different chart choices that you're using. So do I use a bar chart or a line graph, depending on what different data I've got? And there are quite a few really good resources out there now. The main one I tend to use is the Financial Times Visual Vocabulary, which breaks data into different types. So maybe you've got categorical data that you want to visualize with some different values. Maybe you've got temporal data or hierarchical data. So thinking about when I've got certain types of data, how do I then go ahead and represent them on the page? And then the final one here is annotation. So using text and using either callouts on the charts or using the contextual information that you can put in the title, that you can put in a subtitle, or around the outside of your charts that really add to and help the user then think about what is being shown in your charts. So the two standard charts that I'm going to focus on are the basic bar chart and the standard scatter plot. And it might seem oversimplified, but once we get to some of the football charts later, I think these are two ways of presenting data that are very common, that are often kind of done in a default way, as opposed to thinking about how to add a few little things that can take 2 or 3 minutes to make them a lot more effective and a lot more powerful. So we'll start with the bar chart. So the bar chart uses the visual attribute of length to encode the data. So the longer the bar, the greater the value, the shorter the bar, the smaller the value. And very quickly that allows the reader to see the range of the data. So what's the highest, what's the lowest, and also where different things fit in between. So this is what you'll get if you create a bar chart in Tableau. The default chart that will pop out will look something like this, and the bar chart is the best way of actually going ahead and presenting information across several categories, because it is so easy for the eye to pick out the difference between these different bars and the different lengths of the bars. But the default that Tableau spits out, while it's good for a quick visual analysis, it isn't necessarily something that is ready to be put into a report. So I've detailed here a few of the steps that I would take, and as I said earlier, this kind of stuff only takes 2 or 3 minutes. And once you've actually done this, you can duplicate the page, and the formatting settings that Tableau uses will be assumed for the next time you make this as well. So the first one, if we just flick between these a few times, the first one is to remove those grid lines. In this case, they're very faint, but when we think about the concept of something called data ink, so that is all of the non-essential bits of ink or pixels that take up part of the screen. Removing all of those so that the focus is purely on the data is one of the quick wins that you can do. I would caveat that with, if you do not add the labels to the end of the bars, it becomes very difficult if you've not got a scale, for example, an axis with grid lines, it becomes difficult to read it. So that would be the next thing to do. Add those labels to the end of the bars. Use a number of decimal places that makes sense. So the data that was being driven for this particular chart, there was 3 or 4 different decimal places at the end of it. We probably could have afforded even less here, but given that there was, for example, we're looking at Hull City and Sheffield Wednesday, both of them being on 50, or rounding purposes, Hull City and Sheffield Wednesday, then you can just make sure that the number of decimal places is appropriate for what you're trying to show. Next thing here is thinking about whether the bar chart is shown vertically or horizontally. So if you've got long labels, such as we've got here in the different teams, then I would always advise going from left to right. It makes it so much easier to read than here, where you have to tilt your head and start to hurt your neck and strain to actually read the values. So working from left to right is a lot more easier than trying to read upwards. Sorting the bars if appropriate. So again, in this case, skipping back between them, it's very quick to identify that Leeds United are the highest, and that next to them, Luton Town are actually the lowest in this example. But sorting those bars not only makes it aesthetically easier, but it gives a ranking, a natural ranking that makes it much more easier to compare values that are quite close together. So sorting those, I say where appropriate. I can't think of an example off the top of my head where it isn't necessarily appropriate, unless perhaps there is some kind of natural ranking or order to the values. So if we're thinking about teams in the Premier League table, if you want to assume the standings instead and use that as an order, then if there is some kind of default sort that might assume something a bit more powerful, then use that. But usually I think sorting the bars makes it easier to understand them. And then there's a couple of more aesthetic things that you can do to your chart. So we're talking about opacity quite a lot. So how transparent the different bars are. When I'm working in Tableau, I'll tend to drop the opacity to about 80% for my bar charts, and then to add a slightly light border around them, and it makes the bar stick out. Again, it's aesthetic. It's not an essential, but it's something that I tend to do that is consistent across all of my charts, that give them a bit more of a nice feel for people to look at. So those are the kind of things when you're thinking about actually formatting them, and you don't necessarily need to tell a story. The data speaks to itself. This is the default things that you can do to your bar charts to make them a little bit cleaner. The next progression from this is actually going ahead and turning it into more of a story and creating something that is ready for a report. So say you're the performance analyst, you're preparing a report on a weekly basis for the upcoming club. There's a couple of things that you can do here to make it easier for the end user to then actually consume that data. First thing here is the use of color. So we've already talked about length as the visual attribute that we're encoding the data with. We've also applied color here. We've actually done two things. First thing is to gray out the bars. So I often say that gray is one of the most powerful colors in visualization, just because of the power that it has to bring out anything else. It seeps into the background, so that the important information that you're calling out really pops out into the foreground. So that's the first main thing I'm doing here. Say next week's opposition is Cardiff City. Instead of making the user search for Cardiff along this graph, I'm pulling it out using color, and then I'm adding it to that title. So I'm drawing some kind of conclusion from the data. You'll notice the other thing here is adding an average line across all of the data. That's something that's relatively easier to do just from the analytics pane. So I'm using the average line, I'm using color, and then I'm bringing those together in a title so that the person that is looking at this for the first time can quickly see the conclusion that I've taken, and he can see that I've backed that up with the information, and he's got all that context of maybe the previous week you were playing Millwall, and you know that then they've got a similar expected goals as the team from the previous week. It's a mundane example, but you can take it and you can apply that kind of use of color alongside a powerful title that makes a statement to really help the person that's going to be using the information at the end of this. Next up, we're going to talk about the scatter plot, something that comes up again a lot when thinking about correlation. So thinking about two continuous variables that then might be split by a further categorical variable. So we've got a few examples here of, I think it's the number of open play crosses being played and the number of wins or the number of points, something like that. So the scatter plot uses the attribute of position. So where each of these individual dots or circles is positioned on the plot tells us its relationship with the y-axis and with the x-axis. And therefore you can take away, well, that's where it sits in relation to all of the other different points on the screen. So again, going back, same format as with the bar chart, we're starting off with how the scatter plot actually looks. Really useful for identifying whether there is some kind of relationship between two different metrics. So it's number of goals as opposed to number of open play crosses. I think this data comes from the Bundesliga, so we'll have a look at that a little bit later. So this is the basic plot. Again, there are things that we can do to this quite quickly to make it a lot more powerful. So this is my formatted version. Again, not necessarily ready for a report, but for actually giving the analyst or the person that's going to be reading this a bit more information. First thing I did was, you'll notice that here my y-axis and my x-axis both start at 0, and that is giving us a lot of blank space between in the bottom half of the graph. Now, when we're displaying something like a bar chart, I would encourage you never to ground the axis at anything other than 0. But when we're using a scatter plot, and we've got very clear axis labels about where it starts and finishes, then it's okay to actually untick that option where we include 0, so that the data becomes into focus a lot more. Next thing I've done is you'll see I have added a subtitle. So talking about the relationship, and that again, that goes in line with my trend line, which is showing the correlation between the two factors that I've got here. So there is a positive correlation, and you'll see that I've highlighted that as well with a certain color to draw the attention and draw the focus to what is going on here. So in this particular scenario, we can see that as open play crosses per game increase, the goals per game also increase in general. There's nothing here about the strength of that trend. There's definitely nothing here about causation. So something that in statistics you have to be very wary of and very careful with when you're talking about a correlation. It doesn't mean that one has caused the other. It means that there is, as one increases, then the other increases also in general. And as you hover over these lines in Tableau, you'll get more descriptive statistics around the strength of that correlation. So how far is the spread of the data away from that particular trend line? And does that mean that, sure, there is a trend, but it's a very weak trend? Next thing I did was add the dots. So you don't want to make this too crowded. I think already this is starting to look quite busy. Maybe I want to, as an analyst, only choose to highlight specific teams. Maybe I want to have Bayern Munich up there in the top. My next week's opposition, my previous week's opposition, and perhaps a few of the people that are in competition for places around where my team is at any one time. But adding those labels in obviously gives the context if you were playing. The other thing that I have seen quite regularly is using clubs badges instead of the circles. That's fine. The difficulty then arises when two teams are very close in their position on the chart, and therefore they start to overlap, and then you start to not be able to see a particular team if you're looking for it. But adding in clubs badges as shapes, something relatively easy to do in Tableau, and then you can apply them to your charts as well. I mentioned opacity in the previous one. Opacity in scatter plots is much more important than in the bar charts because it's actually showing us something here. It's not just an aesthetic thing, it is showing us, in this case, we've got Wolfsburg and we've got Dusseldorf, both there kind of layered on top of each other. And as you have more and more points, the opacity becomes even more important because the likelihood is that there are going to be different circles and different dots layered on top of each other. And so the opacity then adds another level of insight to show you where things are clustering if they are on top of each other. So dropping the opacity 80%, even lower sometimes, can pull out those insights where dots are over crossing each other and so on. Finally, then thinking about the for different reports, very similar to in the previous example. We've used color here. We've dropped the color of all of the remaining things. So let's say that Borussia Dortmund are our next opponent. We're coloring them in, and we are actually adding a bit of an annotation with some further information in here. So think back to the beginning when I was talking about the encoding, the representation, and the annotation. Here we've got an annotation that actually exists on the chart, and I've also then changed the spin. So previously I was just explaining what was happening in the chart. But now I've really focused in on next week's opposition, Dortmund, and thinking about what the story is with that particular point. So it transpires that despite the trend line of more goals per game than open crosses, Dortmund score a lot of goals relative to the other teams in Bundesliga, but they don't put in too many open play crosses. So that, again, that might be something that you can take away and you can give to the coaching staff, and they will look at the title straight away, and they'll understand it, and then they'll refer to the data to then back that up, and perhaps they can develop a game plan off the back of that. So you'll see the three steps that we've gone through, the basic charts to the refined charts, the formatted charts that you can use every day in your analysis, and then finally the report ready charts that are there sitting in the pack that is ready to go to the coach, to the manager, to actually explain very quickly and very succinctly what is going on in the chart so that they can take an action off the top of that. So that ends our section, or our first half, on the standard charts that we'll see across any kind of business. Now I want to focus really on football specific charts, things that you see in football more than you see elsewhere. So there's two of these, the shot maps, anything using a pitch as context in the background, that one we'll focus on, and then we'll have a look at the radar chart, which seems to be everywhere in football, and we'll have a little think about why that has come to be and whether that is a good thing. So first, the shot map. This, effectively thinking about it, this is the same as the scatter plot. We're using position, but instead of just having a blank background, we've got something that adds context. We've got the football pitch that we can actually look at and then start to think, okay, this is where people are taking shots from. Are they in the box? Are they in the 6-yard box? Are they taking shots from outside the box, perhaps? We're using the pitch and what we know about the spaces on the pitch to enhance that analysis. So to do this, I just want to quickly review a few different examples out there. First one we've got is from Peter McKeever, working at Statform at Opta. And a lot of the following examples, specifically this one and the next one actually, are really well optimized for Twitter. So they're designed for static consumption. They're designed for quick consumption on social media. And I really like Peter's design. He does tons of really good stuff using matplotlib, a Python package. And in this case, we've got lots of different charts all stitched into one so that people can understand the context of a particular player. But we focus really in on the shot maps. Again, he's using opacity. So he's fading all of the other people's touches out into the background so that they're still there for context, but they're not the focus of the visualization. He's then using shape and fill. So if a circle is filled in, then it is a goal or an assist. If it is dimmed out or it doesn't have a fill, then it is an attempt, so a shot or a shot that has come from an assist. And I think that's a really powerful way of using something like shape to direct the focus, because something is filled in, then it seems to carry a bit more weight, a bit more significance than if it is empty. And so he's using that tactic to really focus in on the goals and the positions that they've been scored from, while not losing that extra context of all of the things that didn't happen, that were attempted, that weren't scored. And you'll also notice the dark background, which, again, something I think is optimized for Twitter and for consumption on screens. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next one, also from Opta. This one is by Tom Warville, who now works at The Athletic. This one's just focusing, so it doesn't have all the extra information around the outside. It is just focusing on the shot map. So this one's of Tammy Abraham, again using opacity. You'll notice that the circles that are layered on top of each other, you can see where those circles are. They're not filled in, so that you can't tell what is underneath another particular circle. What I also really like about this one is how he's added the stats, the aggregated stats of the goals, the attempts, the expected goals for the particular player. So that gives you the aggregated version, and then you can see. I think the interesting point that he was trying to make is that Tammy Abraham, you're expecting him to be a striker that gets in the box, that finishes shots quite close to the goal. But according to his shot map, I can't remember exactly when this was from, but there were none in that 6-yard box just in front of the goal. Next one I want to look at StatsBomb, and I need to be careful here because there's a couple of examples. There's this one, and also thinking about radar charts. Now, StatsBomb are wonderful for all of the information that they put out there, the resources we've spoken about already, and also the great analysis that they do for different clubs and the packages and support that they provide. But in terms of this particular chart, I really struggle to get something from this. So first of all, thinking about opacity again, I can see in some cases they've used it, but in other cases they've not. So thinking about those marks that are laid on top of each other, are we missing something here? Very difficult to tell. Next thing is size. So size isn't used at all here. They've used different visual attributes. So they've used shape a lot. They've used color. They've used position, but size hasn't been used in this particular example. Color here is expected goals. They've chosen a color scheme that goes from blue being low to orange being high. There are Tableau users out there, they'll know that the default color scheme in Tableau is blue and orange, but it is the opposite way around, which can be confusing sometimes. So usually orange will default to being low and blue will default to being high. But I think it's the thing that prevents me from taking stuff from this chart is the number of shapes that are being used here. So we've got two different categories being displayed. We've got whether the actual source of the shot, so is it free kick, or is it come from open play, is it header, but also then the outcome of the shot by using a border and a fill. And we'll get to this in a second, but I feel that there's an overload of information here. It's very difficult to tell what is going on. Where do I focus first? And quickly it becomes a bit of a blur, and I lose focus on the actual thing that I'm trying to understand. Next up, we've got Wisecout. So they actually use a range of charts. Instead of just doing a single chart to show the shots, they'll use the position of the shot on the area distribution graph, and then they'll use the net next to it of where that shot actually landed, where it ended up for the outcome of it. But my issue here is that there is so much information stored behind a shot that we want to use that information and actually bring it out and show it in our charts, not just where the shot was taken from and where it ended up, but the expected goals, whether it actually ended up as a goal. We haven't used color at all here to show whether it's a goal or not. And again, opacity it's non-existent. So we'll see on target in the middle of that goal. It's very difficult to tell how many dots there are there. So with all of this in mind, I've brought this together and I've created it in Tableau. It's very similar to Tom Warville's example with a couple of small differences. The first is that we've gone for a light background. Now, when you're developing these reports, they're going to be printed out, perhaps they're going to be, it depends on the format that they're going to be absorbed in. And often I think light and dark backgrounds come to a preference, a particular preference. So for me, I will actually use all of the apps on my MacBook in dark mode. I'm not really sure why. I think it's because it's novel. Perhaps if they bring out a new update and everyone will return to light update. I'm not really sure exactly, other than the idea that people staring at screens a lot will look at dark backgrounds, and it'll be a bit more easy on the eye than looking at light backgrounds the whole time. It comes down to personal preference. But the additional thing here really is thinking about the interactivity that Tableau and using tools like Tableau will bring, as opposed to something that is created for the purpose of Twitter that is static. So the first thing here, we've got the filtering system where we see player name. You can switch through from, in this case, Magdalena Eriksson from the Chelsea ladies team to any of the other players, and you can very quickly use that to switch between different players to see their particular shot maps. And the second thing is the tooltip. So something that you don't get on Twitter is being able to hover over a dot and you get all that extra information, such as the shots type, the stuff that StatsBomb tried to show in their different shapes. Because we're using this interactively, we can hover over any of these and we can get that information from it. This is the theory, that the stuff that I was talking about when we refer to the StatsBomb graph. So cognitive overload. You might get, the best way I can explain this is when you're thinking about a computer and it gets very, very hot, it starts making a loud noise, the fan starts whirring. That's when the computer is trying to do too many tasks. And it might occur when you've got something that's particularly intensive open on your computer. So perhaps if you're running a particular script, or if you're running a Tableau prep flow that is particularly intensive, then that's when your computer starts to get very hot. And the same thing happens to the brain. When you're looking at something, your brain is trying to figure out all the different visual attributes that it's seeing on the screen. Which is why something that is simple, that is, there's Apple use it a lot. There's a lot of beauty and simplicity. Here we've got, we're using size for the expected goals, we're using color, and we're using position. And that it's relatively easy then to see where the goals are being taken from, the type of shots that Magdalena as a central defender is taking. So she's all around the boxes and most likely going to be from corners. Whereas as soon as we, this is actually the same information, same person. As soon as we switch it to shape, the cognitive load increases to an extent that it's really difficult to see what's going on. The other downside is that it's more difficult to reduce the opacity of things like this as well. And then the final part of this, that taking it further, is thinking about then, well, we've created a single graph, but wouldn't it be great to be able to use that graph alongside other graphs to really get the context of what is going on in different places as well? So again, this is thinking back to more Peter McKeever's style, where he's got several different charts all creating a story together. And we can do exactly the same in Tableau, but we can also bring in different charts and click on them to actually see. So in this example, when I click on a particular dot on my screen, then it's going to highlight that dot and it's going to change the shot stats behind it. Maybe I want to do a group of shots. So I just want to focus on all of the shots taken from the left-hand side of the pitch. Then again, it's going to filter that automatically. We're using actions on our dashboard to really focus on what's going on the screen. So I think that brings this section on football pitches to an end. Again, I think I'm doing not great on time, so we'll move on to the next section, but I will take some questions afterwards, and I'm happy to stay around for a bit longer if needed. So with that, we'll move on to the radical radar chart. This one uses size, so the size of the radar that spans to the different corners of your radar background to actually show whether a particular player or a particular team has done well in a particular attribute. So often you'll have maybe between 6 and 10 different attributes around the side of the circle, and the extremities of your particular outline will try and reach to the particular points that they access on that radar. So where did the radar come from, and when I started thinking about this, I was wondering, why has this become so prevalent in football? And my hypothesis is that it came from something like this. So FIFA and Football Manager video games have been around even before people started getting really into football analytics. And so it fell on the responsibility of the user experience designers to create something that people could use to compare different players together. So in this case, I'm not sure it's either Spanish or Portuguese, the screenshot I've taken here. But you've got the simple radar chart, and it looks at 6 different attributes, and then if you select another player, then you're able to quickly see, okay, who has got more speed, who has got better finishing capability, and so on. And so it's a very quick and very easy way to compare across several different categories the different attributes that different players might have. It's a really effective way of doing that, especially when you've got lots of different attributes that you want to compare. So here we've got another example. This one was created by Fuad, and he created something in a very similar style, but within Tableau. So just to show that it is possible to do this in Tableau, he basically created a FIFA 19 dashboard where he took the user experience and the user interface of FIFA, and he applied it to his visualization that compared lots of different footballers and on different stats. You'll notice that I'm talking about opacity again, thinking about whether we fill in the radar or we just leave the outlines. I would always use a fill. I think it makes it easier to see the kind of shape, the sphere of what the actual radar is telling us. The other thing that FIFA and this one does really well is that it normalizes it on a scale. So as we progress through here, I return to StatsBomb, and again, when I look at these, there's a couple of things that I find difficult. Now, on a positive perspective, it's really, really great for branding. They are really, really eye-catching, and I think the source of the StatsBomb radar chart was from an infographic looking at some NBA, comparing different NBA players, and from that perspective, I think it is really good. But from the perspective of trying to present information in a clear and well-styled way, there's a couple of challenges. First one is the scales. So when we're thinking about the FIFA radar charts, it's always working on a normalized scale from 0 to 100, 100 being the best you can possibly be and 0 being the worst. The issue with these radars is thinking about every single different attribute has a different scale associated with it. And I believe the way that they do it is they take the highest and the lowest 5%, and that is the scale for that particular year, for that particular template. So in this case, the striker. Now that you have to learn that, you have to commit that information to memory. And once you've done that, if that were to change, so again, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think this changes from 2017-18 to the following season, or they'll do periodic reviews of it. And so the scales will change actually the way that you consume the graph. Plus, I think the way that the bold font is actually kind of going out makes it, again, slightly difficult to read. Again, this is my take of this, and StatsBomb do a lot of good stuff for the community, and people can take their own opinions on it. But this is how I'm seeing this graph. Next thing is the concentric rings and the way that they move outwards. So if we go on to this, not this particular example, but this next example, they've lost the concentric rings, and suddenly I think this becomes a lot better in the way that the chart was designed. We're using opacity again, in this case, to show the shape of different players. And the reason I put this previous slide in was because when I see 3 like this, I'm instantly trying to compare them alongside each other. So where does someone have a spike? Where does someone not have a spike? So Aubameyang, for example, has a spike in turnovers, whereas the other players do not. But as soon as we start to layer the different radars on top of each other, becomes a lot more easy to see those different distributions. Now, obviously, the limiting factor here is that we can't layer 10, 15 different charts. It becomes far too difficult to read. So thinking about layering maybe 2, maximum 3 different players on here to compare them makes it much more easy to see the different shapes, who's good for different attributes. So finally, as I did before, this one isn't quite as refined as the pitch map, but this is something that my colleague at Biztree, Anoop, built for an upcoming blog. And this is the same radar chart is created within Tableau this time, and it's using the opacity. We've got the overlays. You've got a filtering system, so you'll see the little 3 lines at the top. You've got a filtering system hid underneath that, so you can change the different players and who you're going to be seeing on here. But if you are going to use the radar charts, then the important things I would think about are layering 2, maximum 3 players on top of each other to actually see the footprint of the template that they overlay each other with. So using opacity. Also thinking about normalizing or standardizing the scales in some kind of way. So FIFA works well because it's relatively easy to think about something between 0 and 100, whereas some of the, as I mentioned, some of the StatsBomb scales, more difficult to intuitively understand straight away what the different levels or what the different numbers would actually mean. And labeling, I've put here consistently but sparingly. So again, thinking about the footprint of the different scales and what the background you're actually going to be using, what the different circles represent. They represent a value jump of 10, 20, 30, making that clear, but not necessarily overpowering the user with what you're going to be doing on it. I'm conscious now I've got to time, so I'm going to skip through these. Alternatives, there are a couple of alternatives, and I'm going to revert to back into FIFA for this example. So here we've got what we're trying to show here is the magnitude and the visual vocabulary that I mentioned that was created by the FT a little bit earlier, the way of showing different types of data. Andy Kriebel has put this into Tableau so that you can actually go and see different ways of visualizing it, the same information, but using different charts. So here are a few different ways on there, and you can check that out later as well. But if we return to FIFA, this is the alternative way of how the UX designers working at EA Sports or at FIFA have decided to show information on a more detailed level. So these effectively, we've got our little half moon kind of dials at the top, but everything else is effectively a very nicely designed bar chart. And you can achieve that effect in Tableau. It just takes a little bit more work than thinking about the standard formatting things that we did earlier. But here we've got our alternative radars displayed as a bar chart, but as a very nicely and well-refined bar chart. So I would advise when you're thinking about designing things that you want to pop off the screen, that I think one of the reasons for using a radar is that it is engaging. It kind of gets people engaged and looking at it and wanting to learn more about it. Whereas this is more, it's still engaging, but it isn't. It's also quicker to understand the different levels. And if you can do something like this, I think there's work that needs to go into the background, actually working out of the metrics which category they're going to sit in. So FIFA have been using this for some time, but working out which different metrics sit into which different hierarchies or categories. But something like this, if you presented this to a manager, obviously without the FIFA style to make it appear like a video game, but creating something like this that has a really good user experience that you can quickly get the different metrics, I think would be a really nice way of presenting information about a particular player to a coach that they could quickly understand and get to know more about. Final example was these polar area charts. So this is a little bit more niche. They're very similar to radar charts in what they're trying to achieve, but instead of using the central point of each of the metrics, they actually fill outwards from the start up until the end. So this is more about thinking about if you want the area of your radar to cross over the different metric lines, or whether you want it to fill out from the middle and going outwards. So again, it's more of a design choice, but I think these arguably are a little bit more clear to read as well when you've got the labels on them. And then the history of these, actually, you can layer different people on top of these, but the history of these comes from a chart that was created many years ago by Florence Nightingale. And it's often referred to either as a coxcomb chart or a Nightingale rose chart. And actually, you'll see these used elsewhere in football when you're thinking about pass maps and win maps. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end. I appreciate that I'm later on than expected, but if you are looking for design inspiration, thinking about making visualizations in Tableau looking more aesthetically pleasing, looking more stylish, I can recommend checking out this website, material.io. It's something that talks about design from a web user interface perspective. There seems to be a bit of a theme, a bit of a craze around Tableau Public at the moment, where people are trying to design these very nice, well web-defined, designed looking dashboards that basically use the sales data that comes as default by Tableau. But having a look through these can give you some tips and tricks. And then the other place is just thinking about how designers actually go about designing games that anyone can play. So they're thinking about their audience, they're thinking about ways of displaying data in a way that the person that's going to be using it, whoever that may be, can take action off that. So just going and having a look at some of the screenshots of different games out there and thinking about how you might be able to bring some of the techniques of that into your data visualization work might not be the worst thing in the world. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I know that it's 25 to 12 now, and we said we'd finish at 11:30, but I will take any questions if you'd like. I saw that there was a couple of comments coming up while we were talking. I think Ravi was talking about so StatsBomb have actually written about their radar charts, and if people would like to read up more about them, then we can share that one as well. So just check. I think we are all good. So Oscar, would you like to close things out?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just wanted to really thank everyone for their time. Obviously, there was a ton of questions that came out from Hannah's presentation, And James, I thought that was brilliant. That was really, really engaging, and yeah, got a lot from it myself, to be honest, as an avid football man, as well as that. So yeah, the next call to action really is we are planning on having another event next. So Eva's organising that with a few of our contacts. So really our ask from you away from that is we actually beat the attendance record of 100, which we mentioned. So our ask from you for the next time, obviously based on it being public facing, whether or not we need to find out from the club or the organisation that we're working with if we're able to do that. But if you could at least bring one more person who you know is interested in football analytics or someone else who works within you at the club or the national team, then that's our ask from you, is we really want to grow this community. You can see just from the questions that we had from Hannah around that. But yeah, from us, we really hope that you found it all useful. Really keen to hear from you. So if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to Hannah, James, Eva, myself on LinkedIn. Already had 3 or 4 requests sent across some of the football information that we've got, and again we found out some more stuff today that we'll include in that. So yeah, just a really big thank you to everyone who's attended, and look forward to hosting you all next time. And again, a massive give a round of applause, but we don't have obviously a room here, to Hannah and James for their presentations. And yeah, everyone stay safe and have a good rest of the week.
Thanks, Oscar.